Tae-yoon didn't understand what was happening because he was completely sure he was home alone. However, In-hoo grabbed him by the shoulders and asked if he hadn't calmed down yet. The guy looked at him and started to smell some strange, sweet odor, assuming that it was probably omega pheromones. Suddenly, he smiled, opened his eyes wide, and began to repeat his name over and over again. The guy was puzzled and tried to ask the guy what was going on around them. The only thing that bothered him was that he was too hot. So he apologized, explaining that he was experiencing some strange sensation in his body. He asked if he was okay. Then he explained that he was just going through a special period. However, this surprised Tae-yoon because it was not supposed to start so early. In addition, he was worried that he hadn't even had time to take his medication. However, when In-hoo touched his face and asked him to look at it, Tae-yoon was confused because he couldn't understand why this was happening. The guy kept looking at him and reassured him, saying that he would take care of everything. And then he advised him to just stay still. After these words, Tae-yoon opened his eyes. It turned out that he was lying alone in his bed. He got up, held his head, and realized that he had had the same dream again, which had been haunting him for several days. At the same time, his phone began to buzz near his hand. It was his alarm clock, reminding him that he had to get ready. So he tried to get up, but his mind kept thinking about In-hoo, the guy who was his first love. He began to remember that day. Then, right after they spent the night together, In-hoo just left without saying goodbye. So, while he was getting dressed, the memories came flooding back, and he wondered if he was okay. He thought that it was like a dream that he could never forget, until he heard his phone ringing. It was his mother, who asked if he was well prepared for his first day at work. Tae-yoon smiled and replied that of course he was. His mother continued and asked him how he liked the rice cakes and if they were good. He replied that she shouldn't worry about it. After that, the woman reminded him that the world is a cruel place and advised him to treat his neighbors if he decided to move. She also told him not to forget to clean up. Tae-yoon was making coffee and remembered that he was going to treat them, but it turned out that no one was home. So he decided to visit them another time. Eventually, after a while, he found himself at the door he needed. Looking forward to meeting them, he wondered who his neighbors were. However, after he rang the bell, he heard a child's voice answering and asking who was there. Tae-yoon realized that they must have a child. So he said hello and explained that he lived in the neighborhood and wanted to treat them to rice cakes. The kid at the door asked him to wait a second so he could open the door. His voice was so gentle that a smile immediately appeared on Tae-yoon's face. Finally, he heard a creak and saw a little boy with wide green eyes behind the door. To him, the child seemed very cute. However, as he looked into his eyes, he suddenly realized that the boy looked familiar. Tae-yoon noticed that his new little friend did not take his eyes off his gift, so he gently apologized. Then he crouched down to be closer to the boy, smiled, and asked if there were any adults at home. The boy said yes. At the same time, he suddenly froze in place because he heard a familiar voice, the one that belonged to In-hoo. An adult man actually came up to the boy and began to tell him what he had already told him to wait. After that, he asked why he was disobeying him. However, before the boy could answer, he looked up and asked Tae-yoon if he was really their neighbor. Then he introduced himself and said his name was In-hoo. The guy couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't understand how this was possible, so he asked him again what his name was. Finally, In-hoo began to remember and realized who he was. So, in turn, he asked if he was really Tae-yoon. The boy's eyes immediately began to fill with tears. He couldn't believe it was true, because in his dreams he felt constantly devastated. In-hoo touched his face with his hand, trying to calm his neighbor down, and repeated his name again. Tae-yoon closed his eyes and immediately felt warm. He hoped that this feeling would disappear when he woke up. Then, unable to resist, he came closer and hugged the boy tightly. He also said that he missed him very much and never forgot him. Their sensual encounter was interrupted by the boy grabbing his father's apron and asking him if the man was his friend. At the same moment, In-hoo pushed the boy away, realizing that he needed to get out of the situation somehow. But he couldn't think of anything better than to sit down closer and remind him that it was time for the boy to go to kindergarten. Meanwhile, Tae-yoon realized that no matter how shocked he was, he still shouldn't have done it. At the same moment, In-hoo tried to explain to his son who the uncle was, so he said that it was his old friend. However, Tae-yoon didn't really like this explanation. He realized that 5 years had already passed, but he couldn't do anything about it. Eventually, In-hoo looked up and returned to talking to his new neighbor, noting that it had indeed been a long time. He said that he didn't think they would meet again and asked if the guy was doing well now. Tae-yoon seemed to hear what he was saying, but his mind was elsewhere. He was relieved when he saw that there were no bruises on the boy's body. In-hoo realized that he was too impressed by their meeting, so he asked him if it was time for him to go to work. The guy finally remembered that he really shouldn't be late, but finally took In-hoo's hands and offered to talk about everything later. Looking into the puzzled eyes of his now neighbor, he asked him to wait for him. He decided to agree because he couldn't say anything else to a guy who looked like a little puppy. Tae-yoon was very happy, so he smiled and said that he had to go because he had an important day today. In-hoo smiled after him because he realized that even though he had grown up, he remained just as kind and polite. But when he hurried away, he couldn't believe what had happened because he thought he would never see him again. Instead, however, they are now neighbors. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by his son running towards him and shouting that he was ready to go. In-hoo sat down next to the boy and began to examine him. Then he noticed that he hadn't buttoned his shirt properly. The man tried to be cheerful with his son, helping him to correct his mistake, but his thoughts were elsewhere. As he hugged the boy, he remembered that it had been 5 years since he had run away and was living with Tae-in, so he didn't know if everything would be okay now. Meanwhile, Tae-yoon arrived at his new job. A woman introduced him to her colleagues and said that he had just joined their team. After that, she turned to Kang Hae-sun and asked him to take care of the new employee, as she had heard that they had gone to the same college. The latter smiled and welcomed the new colleague to their team, for which the guy thanked him. In fact, his thoughts were not about work right now. He wanted to get out of here as soon as possible because he couldn't get used to the fact that In-hoo was his neighbor. Tae-yoon remembered the day his family had just moved in and he and his mom found out about his second gender. That's when they met. The documents said that, as expected, he was alpha. Although the guy had known about it for a long time, his mom said that it didn't matter to her whether he dated a man or a girl. However, Tae-yoon didn't think about it. He just wanted to eat and drink. He knew that alphas and omegas are naturally connected to each other. His parents are a great example of this. So back then, he dreamed of being a beta. At that time, he didn't know that things would change and listened carefully to his mom, who asked him to be careful with their neighbor, the Omega In-hoo. He was indeed very nice, and when they first met, he immediately smiled and greeted him. Tae-yoon's mother noticed that it was the first time they were meeting, so she introduced her son. The latter, in turn, blushed. In-hoo gently adjusted his hair, which was falling over his ear, and smiled at his new neighbor once again. Tae-yoon was very nervous, so he looked down and said that he was pleased to meet him. Their next meeting took place a few days later, while In-hoo was smoking a cigarette on the balcony. He immediately put it out and, trying to clear the smoke, asked Tae-yoon why he was here so early. He smiled and explained that it was because he was just taking a mock exam. In-hoo said that he understood now, putting his hand to his neck. However, his bruises became noticeable due to such movements. Tae-yoon saw them and couldn't look away. It seemed strange to him, but he did not dare to ask such details about the life of a person he did not know. And it was always like that. In-hoo looked like he was in danger, but he was smiling anyway. So that day, Tae-yoon decided to invite the boy to have dinner with him. He, in turn, asked if it was really possible. Looking at his charming smile, Tai-Yun realized that he wanted to be the one who would always be on his side. The working day finally came to an end, and he hurried home. On his way up to the 7th floor, he thought only about his neighbor. And when he got out of the elevator, he heard his voice. He met someone at the door and was surprised that he had already arrived. When he came closer, he saw In-Hu talking to a man and asking if he had already had dinner. Tai-Yun couldn't say a word because his dreams were shattered in a single moment. The only thing that interested him now was who this stranger was. Meanwhile, In-Hu picked up Tai-In because he had fallen asleep. The man next to him explained that the boy must have had a good time in the garden. But while they were talking, In-Hu noticed his new neighbor on the stairs, so he immediately turned in his direction. He asked him if he had really just come home from work. He replied that he had. However, instead of talking and explaining, In-Hu emphasized that he would be happy to meet him again. Tai-Yun could only nod in response. And then, sadly, he had to watch his first love, with his son and some man, enter his apartment. Tae-Yun returned home very upset. He remembered how happy he was when he met In-Hu again, but now he tried to put those thoughts out of his mind. Moreover, he realized that In-Hu now had a son, and that could only mean that he was probably in a relationship with someone. At the same time, In-Hu made the man tea and thanked him for bringing his boy. The man assured him that there was nothing to worry about. Instead, he asked who the man he was talking to was. The boy explained that he was an acquaintance of his, so the man did not ask further questions and did not pursue the topic. Later, he emphasized that he had to leave and advised him to call if he needed any help. In-Hu thanked him and said goodbye, calling him uncle. After a while, he started washing the dishes, but his thoughts were only about that night with Tai-Yun. That day, he used it to make himself feel less lonely. So, he didn't want him to have any hopes about him. In-Hu knew that during a special period, alphas become sensitive to omega pheromones. When there are too many of them, the alpha loses control. So he knew he had to be more careful. He closed his eyes and sadly admitted to himself that he was the same coward he had been before. The next day, Tai-Yun met Kang Hye-sun at work, who kindly bought him a drink. The man noticed that he didn't look well in the morning and asked him what was wrong. Tai-Yun didn't know what to say. But the man kept asking questions. He expressed his guesses, believing that the boy might have met his first love, or he might have already had his heart broken. And then Kang Hye-sun suddenly fell silent. He was thinking that it couldn't be because of his first love, because he hadn't dated anyone in college. Tai-Yun explained that if In-Hu could always smile like that, even if he wasn't with him, it would be a truly happy smile. He added that he always wanted him to be happy and still wishes him the same. Tai-Yun said that now they would be as close as before, even if In-Hu still sees him as a younger brother. Kang Hye-sun was surprised to hear that, but he added that they were neighbors and could help each other in difficult times. So his colleague thought that they really should get closer, because it's not easy to forget the person you've loved for so long. However, as he threw the glass in the trash, he did not dare to suggest this to Tae-Yun, believing that it was none of his business anyway. After that, he offered to return to the office, and Tai-Yun agreed. The only thing he asked was if his colleague knew what the kids liked now. He replied that he did not. The next day, Tai-Yun opened the door just as In-Hu and Tai-In were walking in. They greeted each other, and then the boy sat down next to him and asked if he liked Detective Bruce. The boy, with great enthusiasm in his eyes, replied that he really liked this character. So Tai-Yun took out the toy and started talking instead, telling him that Tai-In needed Detective Bruce. The boy started looking at his father to get his permission to get the hero he wanted. In-Hu silently watched what was happening and realized that Tai-Yun shouldn't have done it. In the end, he agreed, only to emphasize to his son that he needed to thank him this time. The boy was very happy about it. After that, they all got into the elevator. However, they all felt very uncomfortable, except for the boy, who was happy. Suddenly, Taiyun started talking, and Inhu was so surprised that he was even a little scared. However, he pulled himself together, smiled, and asked what he wanted to ask him. The guy said he was just wondering if he was free tonight, but In-hoo replied that it would not be very convenient for him at that time. Finally, the bell rang that they had gone down to the first floor, and Tae-in excitedly ran out. In-hoo smiled and said finally that it was time to go. Tae-in waved at the toy and said goodbye to his uncle. Tae-yoon also waved after them, trying to be cheerful, although it was hard for him to do so. From that day on, they began to see each other much more often. For example, it was on a jog when In-hoo was taking out the trash. Tae-yoon tried to make friends with the boy, so he asked him about Detective Bruce, and he always happily told him different stories. Sometimes they would meet in the supermarket when they were both looking for food on the same shelf. Sometimes they would meet in a cafe. Each time, In-hoo was quite surprised by these coincidences, although he didn't pay much attention to it. However, one day he went to the playground with his son, and while he was playing, he sat down on a bench to think about the recent events. He explained to himself that he probably sees Tae-yoon so often because their neighborhood is quite small. At the same moment, he heard a familiar voice calling out to him and saw Tae-yoon, who told him that he was walking and happened to see his back. That's why he decided to come over. Later, the guy sat down next to him and added that he was walking home from the store, so he offered to try some of his products, but the man refused because he understood everything right away. At the same time, Tai-in was playing with the boy, watching ants move on the ground, but he wasn't really interested. He noticed that his father was not sitting alone, and he immediately wanted to run over to them to talk together. In-hoo was surprised by his son's behavior, so he asked him if he wanted to play with his friends. But he stubbornly said that he would stay with him and his uncle. The boy hugged them both and asked his father if he knew that he and Tai-yoon had almost the same name. He turned to his uncle and added that his name was Tai-yoon and his was Tai-in, and asked if they rhymed. Tai-yoon replied that they did. In-hoo just sighed as he watched this conversation. Then he began to recall how he felt after the birth of his son. Recalling those moments, he realized that he wanted to keep a piece of Tai-yoon and make his son look the same, because he didn't plan to ever meet him again. But now, seeing how well the two of them get along, he decided that he needed to sort this out as soon as possible. So he asked Tai-yoon if he would have some free time tonight, offering to have dinner with them. The guy was very excited and gladly agreed to this offer, which he had been waiting for so long. Finally, they met that evening. The boy ate first and asked his father to let him go to see Detective Bruce. He agreed and said he would come to his room later. When the boy left, In-hoo started washing the dishes, and to his surprise, Tae-yoon came to his aid. The boy didn't really want to be helped, but his old friend was quite insistent. In the end, they both started to feel very embarrassed, and in the pitch-black silence, they could only hear the clinking of dishes. Later, In-hoo asked the guy to sit down and said he would bring him coffee. He was puzzled, but did not refuse the offer. So Tae-yoon had time to look around the apartment. It turned out that it was only slightly different from his. He also wondered why the stranger he had seen earlier was not there. In addition, he remembered that he only sees Tai-in with In-hoo all the time, and that man is always absent. He had so many thoughts that he finally decided he didn't need to think about it right now. Fortunately, In-hoo had just brought them coffee. He said he had cooled it down a bit, and Tai-yoon thanked him for it. And that was all they could say to each other then. After that, again, they were both silent and didn't know where to start. After a few minutes, In-hoo finally decided to speak up and ask the boy what he wanted to tell him. So Tai-yoon reminded him of the story that happened 5 years ago and asked why he left so suddenly. In-hoo knew that he would ask him about it, so he reassured himself that he just shouldn't mention his son. The boy recalled how he often smelled the pungent odor of alcohol at home, and that his father called him names and asked him why he was coming home so late. After that, he would constantly yell and emphasize that the boy had no right to look down on him. In-hoo's parents divorced before he graduated from high school. After the divorce, his father used to beat him every time he drank. So he got used to being beaten up unusually quickly. However, one day something changed. A polite couple called at his apartment and said hello to him. They explained that they had moved into the apartment next door and expressed their hope that they would get along well. In-hoo thanked them, although he wondered how an ordinary family could share a rice cake at a time like this. He also remembered his first meeting with Tae-yoon. He was standing behind his mom and was quite shy. He started talking only when the woman lightly pushed him with her elbow, telling him not to stand aside. After that, she patted her son on the head. It was then that In-hoo realized that the boy was raised and educated in love. Also, his mother always said that Tae-yoon was beautiful, but sometimes silly, and asked In-hoo to take good care of him, although her son always disliked it. One day, however, the woman managed to enter the apartment unexpectedly because she heard a strange noise and came to check if anything was wrong. Yes, she noticed what was happening to the boy and what his father was doing to him. In-hoo always answered that everything was fine and made excuses for him, explaining that he didn't do this often, only sometimes when he drinks. The woman was trying to disinfect the wounds and was embarrassed that the boy's beautiful face was so disfigured. However, In-hoo didn't think about it at all. The only thing he asked was that she not tell anyone about it. The woman replied that she would do as he wished and would not interfere. However, she offered to help him if he needed it. He was very grateful for the offer, and since then, the closer he got to Tae-yoon's family, the more he envied him. One day, In-hoo caught up with the boy and started asking him if he was going to work. He replied that he was and asked if it was true that today was his first day at college. Tae-yoon said that he was a little nervous because he wouldn't be able to decide on a direction. Then he asked his neighbor if he had any free time tomorrow or during the week. In-hoo was a little surprised by this question, but replied that he had a morning shift tomorrow. So Tae-yoon offered him dinner. He remembered that he had given him a gift for passing the exam, so he wanted to thank him. In-hoo said that he didn't need anything because he was still a student and shouldn't spend money. However, the guy insisted and explained that he really wanted to treat him. Looking him in the eye and blushing a little, he asked to be allowed to treat him tomorrow. And then, suddenly, he added that he had something else to tell him. In-hoo agreed, smiled, and asked him to let him go. Tae-yoon did so and began to apologize, but he said that it was no big deal. In-hoo tried again to find out what he wanted to tell him, but Tae-yoon said he would talk about it tomorrow. After that, he said he was going the other way and said goodbye. The guy continued to go to work, but the thought that Tae-yoon was very strange kept coming back to him. He really didn't understand what kind of food a freshman could afford. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. He couldn't understand who was calling him, but what he was told was terrifying. His whole body shook as he was told that his father had been in an accident. In the end, he could not be saved and died in the hospital a few days later without regaining consciousness. After the funeral, In-hoo returned to his empty apartment, completely devastated. There was an eerie silence around him. He sat down on the couch where his father used to sit and realized that he was not a good man, but he was still his family. The boy could not hold himself back any longer, so tears ran down his cheeks. He realized that he was really alone now. But things got even worse when In-hoo found out that his father was in debt because he hadn't thought about it and couldn't even imagine it. Luckily, the sale of the house was able to cover everything, but he had to leave anyway. That day, he was very tired. He had just received a message that he was leaving the day after tomorrow, so he was worried about whether he had packed everything. He was also worried about not being able to visit Tae-yoon because everything happened so quickly and they hadn't seen each other since the funeral. So he decided that it would be a good idea to go and talk to him tomorrow. However, he also had another thought. He remembered their last meeting and that he had something to tell him. In-hoo smiled gently and firmly decided that he should ask Tai-yun about it tomorrow as well. The next day, he went to his neighbor's apartment and rang the bell. However, no one answered for a long time, which surprised him. However, after a moment, he did hear a familiar voice asking who was there. In-hoo answered and explained that they needed to talk about something. The neighbor agreed, but In-hoo noticed that his voice sounded unhealthy, as if he was sick. It was also strange that he didn't hear his parents. It was not like them. So the boy got worried and entered the password himself, entering the apartment. But when he smelled the smell and saw Tai-yun, he immediately realized everything. It turned out that he was going through a special period. In-hoo felt very ashamed of himself for barging in like that, so he said he was sorry and assured me that he would leave right away. However, suddenly he froze in place because a strange thought flew through his mind at one point. As he closed the door, In-hoo wondered if he should have a child with Tae-yoon. He realized that he would be taking advantage of the boy, but if he had a child with someone who was raised in a kind and loving family, everything would be different. In-hoo thought that in this case, the child would love only him, so he came closer to Tae-yoon and kissed him. Then he smiled, explaining to the boy that he could help him and assured him that he could fix everything. Tai-yun was overwhelmed with feelings, so he could no longer control himself and agreed to any suggestions. Now, these thoughts did not leave the guy, and he was constantly immersed in the memories of 5 years ago. Tai-yun noticed this and began to address him again to bring him to his senses and finally hear an answer. In-hoo apologized for his behavior, but he couldn't stop thinking about it, let alone looking him in the eye. So he said that he needed to pay off his father's debts as soon as possible, and they decided to sell the house. That's why he left so suddenly. He thought that this was an exhaustive answer, although he was afraid that the guy would start asking for more. He still didn't know what to say to him. However, Tai-yun smiled and touched his hand, asking if this meant he no longer had any problems or debts. The guy confirmed that it did, although he was surprised that he didn't ask him about other things. Tai-yun replied that he was worried when he disappeared so suddenly, but now he was glad that he was okay. In-hoo thanked him for his concern, but still waited for him to ask him about that night, not understanding why he wasn't interested in knowing. Finally, he said that he should stop asking about him and asked how Tai-yun was doing. He replied that he was doing well at work and that his elders had helped him a lot. He also said that he was looking forward to this day. He explained that he was excited to see him again. Living next door to him, he often reminisced about old times. He added that he would be happy to learn more about his son and be his uncle. In-hoo smiled and agreed with his words. Then he asked him to take care of him and the child. Finally, after a few minutes, Tae-yun said it was time for him to go home. He thanked us for dinner and got ready to leave. Little Tae-in ran out to see him off. He also said goodbye to the boy and called him uncle. Tai-yun paused for a second and asked the boy if it was true that he looked old to him. Tai-in put his finger to his chin and said that he might get confused, so to him he was Tai-yun's uncle. In-hoo didn't like his son's behavior, so he asked him not to behave like that. However, the boy said that everything was fine. He patted the kid's head and agreed to be called that. After that, the boy smiled and said that he would be waiting for him to visit again. In-hoo noticed that his son had become good friends with Tai-yun, so he thanked him for tonight. The boy said it was no problem, and then he turned around and left the apartment. When In-hoo and his son were alone, he asked him if he wanted to play with him tonight. He said yes. So, after a couple of minutes, they sat down at the table and Tae-in started drawing his favorite character, Bruce. And then they went to the bathroom to do their evening routine and get ready for bed. After that, In-hoo started thinking about whether to buy more notebooks and crayons. But suddenly he felt very hot, so he assumed that his special period was starting early. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by his son, who jumped into his arms and said he was sleepy. He also asked him to read him a fairy tale. The father agreed, and after saying that they lived happily ever after, the boy fell asleep hugging his favorite toy. In-hoo left Tai-in's room very tired. He was also still very hot. He couldn't believe that he was having a special period, because the last time he had one was before he was pregnant. He sat down on the bathroom floor and began to think about what he could do now, because he was clearly emitting pheromones, but there was no one who could suppress them. At the same time, Tai-yun returned to his home and also felt very bad, because he had also started a special period. Tai-yun barely had time to take off his shoes and immediately ran to find some medicine to help himself. Finally, he ran to his desk and opened the shelf. There was a bottle of pills that he needed right now. After swallowing the required amount, he breathed out a sigh of relief and began to look forward to them working and making him feel better. Tai-yun tiredly sat down on the couch and tried to recover from what had just happened. However, his thoughts were still on In-hoo. The guy was very nervous, but fortunately he started to feel better. And then he realized for sure that everything would be fine as long as they were together. The next morning, In-hoo accompanied his son to kindergarten. A teacher was picking him up, so the boy said goodbye to his father and went to the bus. The boy waved to the departing car, although he was very nervous, trying not to show it to his son. Suddenly, he looked back because he heard someone calling out to him. Looking closer, he noticed that it was Tai-yun. After they greeted each other, he said that he saw In-hoo walking Tai-in to kindergarten. He added that if he had come out earlier, he would have had time to say goodbye to him as well. The boy listened to his story, but his heart was still racing. He could not believe that they were talking. The only thing that reassured him was that he had bought medicine yesterday to suppress his period, so everything was going to be fine. However, Tae-yoon suddenly touched his face gently, which surprised him. He couldn't understand what was going on and why he was suddenly behaving like that. However, his arguments were dispelled when Tai-yoon explained his behavior by saying that he just had rice in his hair. In-hoo blushed and felt ashamed. He was afraid to admit that it was all because Tae-in was a sloppy eater and his food was lying everywhere. However, Tai-yun said that it was nothing to worry about. He also recalled that he had once embarrassed himself in front of him when he wore a shirt with breadcrumbs on it. And then he said he had to go. In-hoo was a little confused because he had completely forgotten about that situation. So he stopped and started to remember what had happened. That day, Ta-yun's mom had bought a lot of groceries, so he kindly helped her carry them. She thanked him for that. But when the woman opened the door to her apartment, she saw her son standing on the threshold, screaming and covered in crumbs. The mother greeted the boy and said that she did not expect to see him at home, and then she asked In-hoo to help her carry everything into the kitchen. That's when Tai-yun blushed, because he realized that he didn't look very good, and his shirt was all dirty. So he apologized for his clothes and said that he would come back as soon as he changed. Then he turned around and started running away. Seeing this, his mom smiled and said that he was very cute and embarrassed. In-hoo replied that she should have warned him that he was coming. Meanwhile, recalling the previous events, the boy had already returned home. Stopping at the door, he noticed that they now lived next door to each other as before. And then he remembered that he needed to take his medication, because it was the only way they could stay together. It hadn't been long since they met again. Tai-yun began to visit the boy more often as he got to know him a little better. This time, however, he told him some unexpected news. It turned out that In-hoo had re-entered the university and would be able to come there after he took Tai-in to kindergarten. He smiled and explained that he was a little embarrassed, given his age, but that it was a great opportunity for him. However, Tai-yun supported him and emphasized that it was, on the contrary, very cool. He also added that it's never too late to learn. So, as they talked, time passed quickly, and they didn't even notice how Tae-in went to bed by himself and fell asleep. So, they had time to talk. In-hoo said that he now had a lot of group projects and unfinished tasks. So he asked the guy to watch his son today and tomorrow. He also told him that Tae-in really likes him and asked if he had ever noticed it himself. Tae-yoon said that he had. Then he agreed to the offer, noting that he didn't have many friends, so he had a lot of free time on weekends. In-hoo thanked him for his help and said that next time he would cook him something to eat. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by Tae-in screaming for his father. In-hoo was surprised that his son woke up so quickly, so he got up and went to the boy's room. At the same time, he asked the boy to wait for him to come in. All the time Tae-yoon spent in the gym, he sat there smiling because he heard Tae-in say so many nice things about him. Suddenly, though, he remembered what In-hoo had told him about the group project. This meant that they would have to meet, and it made him jealous. He began to dream about what would have happened if they had studied together, and that things might have been completely different then. Tae-yoon blushed and began to slap himself in the face for even imagining and thinking about it. However, this moment of weakness was seen by In-hoo and her son, who had just changed their clothes and came into the room. So Tae-yoon was quick to explain that he was just trying to catch a mosquito that was bothering him. After that, he took the boy in his arms and emphasized that he could look after him now. In-hoo thanked him and told him that he would be in the room, so he could call if Tae-in bothered him too much. Finally, he told his son to have fun with Tae-yoon, and the boy agreed, smiling back at him. When they were alone, Tae-yoon asked the boy what they were going to do and what he wanted to do. The boy's eyes began to shine and he suggested playing rainbow characters, to which he agreed. Finally, they started the game. Tae-in put on a cloak, picked up a sword, and started to chase away the child of hell with an ultra-rainbow punch. Tae-yoon fell to the floor, pretending to die, and said he would definitely take revenge on him. So, the boy raised his sword up and said that he had saved the world today. However, as soon as the boy thought they were really done, Tae-in started to pick it up and said that he wanted to start over again. In the end, Tae-yoon was very exhausted because he had played the same game 10 times. His only thoughts were that this child's physical strength was limitless. Fortunately, at that very moment, they heard the door creak and In-hoo's voice. So the boy began to rejoice at the tattoo, and the man began to rejoice at the fact that he was now saved. In-hoo came closer to them and told his son to stop pestering his uncle. When Tae-yoon asked if he was done, he said yes and thanked him for his help. Tae-yoon said that it was not difficult for him. At the same time, Tae-in threw himself into his father's arms, so he asked if he had fun. He said that they were playing rainbow characters. His dad was surprised and asked if Tae-in had managed to beat Uncle Tae-yoon. So, In-hoo told the boy that he really did a good job. After that, he offered him a snack. A few minutes later, he put on an apron and offered to cook him fried rice, because it was his favorite dish. Tae-yoon replied that he would look forward to dinner, but said he needed to use the bathroom for a moment. When he went inside, he noticed that there were only 2 toothbrushes by the mirror, so he wondered who the man he had seen was. He began to think about it and came to the conclusion that it was a day off, and the stranger should have been at home. He wondered what he was doing that In-hoo had to ask him for help. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by the guy saying that the food was ready. Because of this, he had to return to the room. That evening, they ended up having rice and shrimp dinner and talking for a while. After that, Tae-yoon went back home. The next morning, he went to work. However, it was hard for him to work because he was thinking about that man and why he didn't come back so late. He also remembered that he hadn't really seen him since the first time. Although their neighborhood is small and he and In-hoo often run into each other. Suddenly, Kang Hye-sun called him and asked him to come over for a minute, so he was distracted by helping his colleague. Finally, the evening was coming to an end. He had to send the documents and could go home, but the phone rang. It was In-hoo, so he was happy to pick up the phone and ask his friend if he was okay. However, he was very nervous and began to slur his words about how he had done something and couldn't find anyone. Tae-yoon couldn't understand anything and asked him to explain to him again what had happened and why he was so worried. He also thought he was crying, and he was. In-hoo couldn't control himself and just sobbed into the phone, explaining that Tai-in was missing. Tae-yoon couldn't believe what he had just heard. He was dumbfounded and couldn't think about anything else. He took off work and immediately rushed to In-hoo's apartment to help him find his son. Tae-yoon saw him on the street and immediately started asking him what had happened, adding that he couldn't believe it. In-hoo was very nervous and could hardly explain anything. All that became clear from hearing his stuttering was that Tai-in should have been home a long time ago, but he didn't answer his phone. He also mentioned a certain Mr. Yang Seo. Tai-yoon noticed that the boy was shaking, so he realized that he was very scared and needed to be calmed down. So he hugged In-hoo, tapping his back with his hand and pressing his lips to his head. And when the boy looked frightened into his eyes, he asked him if he had calmed down a bit. After that, he asked him to calm down and try to speak slowly to explain what had happened. In-hoo immediately blushed. He felt very strange asking for his help when he couldn't even explain what had happened. So, wiping away his tears, he began to make excuses and apologize for being a little out of it. Tae-yoon replied that it was no big deal because his son was missing. In-hoo continued and added that Tai-in was supposed to come home at 5 o'clock, and he waited, but he still wasn't there. So he decided to call the kindergarten to find out where he was, but the teacher told him that Tai-in had left long ago. Not understanding what was happening, he asked them to check again, but they told him that the boy was definitely with the teacher. Unfortunately, he couldn't get in touch with this man named Yang Seo now, although this had never happened before. After listening to the whole story from start to finish, Tae-yoon advised him to go to the police, even though only an hour had passed. He added that he should also start looking for him where he usually goes and try to contact the tutor again. However, In-hoo said that he had already been there. However, Tae-yoon emphasized that he could go back and better check again. Finally, he said that he would go looking for him and told him to stay put and wait for the police. He agreed and thanked him for his help. In-hoo watched him go, and at that moment he realized that Tae-yoon seemed to have become an adult and had really grown up. Meanwhile, the boy started walking around the neighborhood near their house and shouting for Tae-in. He also went around to all the shops, asking if anyone had come in with the child in the photo. However, the shopkeepers hadn't seen anything like that. Tae-yoon also tried to ask other parents of children of the same age, but it was still in vain. No one had seen the boy. Finally, he asked the security guard to broadcast on the radio that a boy named Tae-in was missing. The guard agreed. Already completely despairing and assuming that something really bad could have happened to him, he heard a phone call. It was In-hoo. He told him that the boy had been found, so Tae-yoon immediately went back and saw him talking to a police officer. It turned out that he had received a call from the father of Tai-in's friend, and he told him about it in detail. Tae-yoon started running towards them, especially when he saw Tae-in next to In-hoo. The policewoman even assumed that he was his father. The boy was also very excited to see Tae-yoon's uncle and threw himself into his arms, which made the boy very happy. Finally, when the police left, Tae-yoon turned to In-hoo and asked him to explain what had happened. He told him that the teacher had sent Tae-in to a second home. Luckily, nothing happened because by pure coincidence, his friend's father heard the announcement that the boy was missing. So he asked the kid if his dad knew he was here, but the latter could not explain anything. So the man who heard the announcement called the kindergarten and brought Tai-in back, coming with him to his house. In-hoo rushed to his son, not believing that he was okay. His heart calmed down only when he saw his smile. The man hugged the boy tightly, although he did not understand what was wrong. He explained that he just missed him today. After that, In-hoo thanked Jun-hoon's dad for bringing him. The man replied that everything was fine and said they should go home. As he approached the apartment door, Tae-yoon said he was glad that everything ended well. However, In-hoo emphasized that it was all thanks to him, and he didn't even know how to thank him. Rubbing his neck, he admitted that he had failed in many things today and was very sorry for that. Tae-yoon said that everything was fine, although what happened today was a surprise. So In-hoo thanked him and invited him to dinner. However, the guy refused, explaining that he was already very tired today. After that, he advised him to go and get some rest. In-hoo was surprised by this answer, but agreed. So they said goodbye and went home. However, as soon as the door closed, the guy realized that he had just rejected him, and he couldn't understand why he was so upset about it. In fact, Tae-yoon wanted to take care of him and calm his heart, but he decided that he shouldn't do it. He was still thinking about that man and couldn't understand why he was gone again at such a time and why In-hoo had called him. He wondered if it meant he should stay with him. It was driving him crazy. So, the next morning he came to work very upset and tired. Even his colleague noticed how many times he sighed during the day. Kang Hye-sun realized that he was probably worried about something and bet that it was related to his first love. Since this situation needed to be resolved immediately, the guy suggested that Tae-yoon go out to lunch together. He was reluctant at first, but he persuaded him. And then, while smoking a cigarette, he began to ask what happened to his first love. Tae-yoon didn't hide anything and told him that these days he had become very close to In-hoo and his son. Kang Hye-sun said that he was right when he noticed that he started coming home right after work and asking about the children's toys. However, Tae-yoon continued and added that he was confused because he had called him yesterday and told him that Tae-in was missing. Fortunately, however, everything was resolved. Putting it all together, Kang Hae-sun assumed that Tae-in was probably the child's name. In addition, he noticed that his and Tae-yoon's names were very similar, although it sounded strange. The only thing he didn't understand and asked the boy why he looked so upset, because he said that everything was fine now. Tae-yoon explained that it was because the guy had a very strange partner, and that he hadn't shown up during the time that everything was happening, and this really makes him angry. He recalled that he doesn't see him on weekends or even most of the time. Instead, In-hoo always takes care of his son by himself. He also added that it was especially hard for him to see this on a day as difficult as yesterday. Tae-yoon broke down and started shouting that if In-hoo was going to continue to date someone who didn't care about them, it would be better if he dated him. But as soon as he said it, he was equally surprised because he didn't expect to hear it from himself. Kang Hye-sun put his hand on his shoulder and asked him to calm down and stop worrying about it so much. Tae-yoon took hold of his head and began to apologize, explaining that he was very sorry and shouldn't have said anything about it. However, despite this, he added that he thought that as long as he was happy, everything was fine, and that just being there for him was enough. But then, again, he became greedy when he started dreaming about how good it would be if they lived together. A colleague realized that the guy needed a break, so he offered to buy them a drink after work to forget about it. He agreed. Meanwhile, In-hoo was studying materials in the library. In the process, he realized that there was much more there than he thought. In addition, he looked at the clock hanging on the wall and remembered that Tae-in was due home from kindergarten soon. So he called his uncle to ask how his son was doing. He told him that he had brought him home and said he would give him the phone. The boy happily picked up the phone and heard his father asking if he had been good to his grandfather. He replied that he had, and his grandfather promised to buy him a cutlet and rice for that. In-hoo replied that this was great, noting that it was his favorite dish. He also reminded him to eat well and not to be a bully. Suddenly, his son sounded sad and asked his father to come back soon because he missed him so much. The man and woman immediately hugged the boy and asked him if he missed them too. He replied that he did. In-hoo emphasized that he also missed him and promised that he would pick him up tomorrow as soon as he could. Tae-in replied that he would wait for him and obey his grandparents, and then he added that he loved him very much. Meanwhile, in the bar, Kang Hai-sun looked at his colleague and realized that although he had offered him a drink, he now saw that he was completely inept at it. So, pouring a glass, he said that it was the last one. After that, he emphasized that he had changed these days. When Tai Yun asked what he meant, he replied that knowing him, he realized that he seemed to be the first. The guy smiled, rubbing the back of his head, and asked him how he had behaved and what he had done wrong. Kang Hee-sun explained that he didn't expect him to go so crazy. However, Tai Yun replied that he was wrong. So his colleague asked him again to stop thinking about it and joked that if he kept worrying about it, he would hit him. Tai Yun smiled when he heard such a threat from his friend and agreed that he would not do it again. After a while, they said goodbye, and Kang Hai-sun went ahead. Tai Yun thanked him for his help. As he walked home, he tried to force himself to forget about everything, because he realized that his feelings would only make things more difficult for In-hoo. Suddenly, however, he stopped, because on the other side of the street he saw the man who had come to see the boy. He couldn't believe his eyes and realized that he hadn't made a mistake, because he was sure it was In-hoo's Alpha. However, he was even more surprised by what this girl was doing next to him and why they were walking with her at such a time. Besides, it was obvious that they were not just friends or acquaintances. There were definitely some feelings between them. And after he saw that they had also kissed, Tai Yun didn't know how to react to it at all. He realized that if he was right and he was really cheating on In-hoo, he would never forgive him. So he called out to the couple while they were catching a taxi. He yelled at them to wait a minute, but they didn't hear him and just drove away. Tai Yun was very angry. He had just almost caught a traitor. He was insulted that he was able to get away. Meanwhile, In-hoo was returning home, and on the way called his uncle to tell him that he was on his way back and to ask how his son was doing. But he heard him playing with a girl who was screaming and complaining that grown-up children should also eat ice cream. They asked their grandparents to buy them what they wanted, although they forbade them to because ice cream should not be eaten so late. However, the woman added that after a while they finally persuaded them. So, after eating, they both fell asleep. In-hoo was smiling when he heard about his son's temper tantrums, but he apologized to his uncle for his behavior. But he said it was okay because Hyojin wanted ice cream too. Finally, he asked the boy if he was done with his work for the day. In-hoo was just entering the password at the door and told him that he was going home. He thanked his uncle for always helping him, although the man assured him that he shouldn't do that because he was his nephew, and then he added that he should call his mom more often. In-hoo froze when he heard these words, but promised that he would definitely do so. After that, he said goodbye to him. In fact, it wasn't that he didn't want to call her, but there were other reasons why he couldn't. His thoughts were interrupted by a strange man standing at the door to his apartment. So he wondered who it was. However, when he got closer, he noticed that it was Tai Yun. His face was radiant and his eyes were sparkling. In-hoo asked what was wrong with him and why he was standing there, and then he emphasized that he should have called him if there was something he needed to tell him. Tai Yun could hardly contain himself, but then he started to talk about why he was standing there, because he was thinking about whether to tell him or not. He looked into his eyes and realized that he had been trying his best to forget about him, but that look filled his heart with happiness. So he gathered all his strength and asked the boy if he could break up with the man he saw standing next to him. Seeing In-hoo's puzzled look, he added that he was not at liberty to talk about it, but emphasized that he had seen him with another woman. Tears began to flow down his cheeks. It was clear that he was in great pain. However, he asked if he could take care of him now. Tai Yun explained that he was sorry to have to tell him about it. Then he confessed that he loved him. In-hoo was completely confused. He was surprised that he was still in love with him, but he didn't understand what the guy meant when he said that he should leave him. So he asked him again who he meant when he talked about this Alpha. He replied that he was talking about the man who brought Tai in last time. In Hu began to guess who he was talking about. However, he was even more surprised that he thought that about his uncle. Finally, he realized that Tai Yun must have misunderstood. And since blood relatives don't smell each other's pheromones, he didn't even know he was an alpha. So he started wiping the guy's tears with his sleeve and said that they probably needed to clear things up from the beginning. In Hu invited him home and said he would clear up this misunderstanding. He asked him to try not to be too surprised and explained that the man he saw was his uncle. Tai Yun was shocked to hear this. His face showed that he demanded an immediate explanation. In Hu began by saying that, as he knew, his parents had been divorced for a long time. So he met his mother in the apartment he moved into after his father's funeral. He clarified that, in fact, it was the place where he and his parents used to go before the divorce, and it was the last place where they were all together. The guy said that, as it turned out, it was his mother's hometown, and on this particular day she was there for work, and his neighbor told her his story. The man was very nice, and they were neighbors. The boy started to remember the name and remembered that his name was Inho. So his mom asked him to take her to him, and the man agreed to help her with that. When they met, he admitted that he didn't think he would ever see her again, and she replied that they should have met earlier. After that, his mom asked him to give her a chance, and said that she would help him and Tae-in any way she could. In-Hu recalled that she also suggested that he go to school and added that this building belonged to her. The boy said that his mother had remarried. Thus, he received a lot of help, and he couldn't ask for more for Tae-in. At the same time, he became close to his uncle, and he is the one person he can trust. Hearing this complicated story, Tae-yun covered his eyes with his hands and explained that he was so ashamed that he could just die. In-Hu began to calm him down and explained that everything was fine, that he was just worried about him because he liked him. These words seemed to pierce the guy with a current. He finally realized that it turns out that In-Hu is not dating anyone right now. He confirmed this, so the guy approached him, trying to kiss him. Before doing so, however, he asked if he could continue to love him and asked him not to push him away. However, In-Hu replied that he was sorry and, as expected, admitted that he hated it. However, in reality, his thoughts were different. He didn't know what he had to do and how he could refuse it. So, in the end, he couldn't do it. So they spent that night together. In the morning, they met in the kitchen. Tae-yun felt a little awkward because he was wearing In-Hu's clothes. But, in fact, he was happy because he was there for him and hadn't disappeared like the last time. So he came closer and admitted that when he woke up and didn't see him there, he thought he had run away again, even though it looked stupid. And when In-Hu said he didn't think so, the boy invited him to stay here with him because he really liked him. In-Hu didn't want to deceive him, so he decided it was time to come clean. So he started by saying that he had to keep an eye on Tae-in all the time. However, Tae-yun asked him to stop. He emphasized that he knew what he wanted to say and explained that he didn't have to meet him right now. The guy said he didn't want to pressure him and asked him to give him a chance. And also, a little time for everything to fall into place. In-Hu was confused. He knew he had to say no, but he also realized that it would hurt him more if he said no. So, in the end, he agreed. However, in return, he asked that Tae-yun accept any answer he gave. Tae-yun was overjoyed and immediately hugged In-Hu tightly, telling him once again that he loved him very much. In-Hu didn't know if he should do that, but he knew he didn't want to hurt him right now. Eventually, after calming down a bit, Tae-yun asked the boy if he had taken his medicine, and he said yes. After a while, he told the whole story to his co-worker on the way to work, and he was amazed. Kang Hee-sun could not believe that the man he was talking about was his uncle. So he emphasized that you can only get this for being too busy or lonely. He also joked that from now on he should call himself the king of jumping to conclusions. Tae-yun laughed in response and asked him to stop making fun of him. Finally, his colleague said that his love was lonely anyway. Tae-yun laughed and said that it was different. After that, Kang Hai-sun asked if he realized that the little boy's father was out there somewhere. Tai-yun sighed sadly and said that he was aware of it, but he was grateful to be able to be with him again. At the same time, In-hoo took his son home and they spent time together. However, his behavior was a bit confusing because he didn't want to show what he was drawing and said it was a secret. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a message from Tai-yun, who suggested that In-hoo and Tai-in go out together on the weekend. He agreed to the offer and asked his son if he wanted to spend time like that, and he replied that he would look forward to it. The next morning, Tae-in couldn't wake his father up and kept asking him to wake up. In-hoo could barely open his eyes and could not understand what was happening and why, on a weekend, his son woke up so early. However, the boy reminded him that they were supposed to meet today and go for a walk with Tai-yun. In-hoo patted his son's head and told him that he had grown up enough to be very independent. He also suggested that they go get ready. A few minutes later, they heard the doorbell ring. The boy ran cheerfully to meet his uncle Tai-yun. In-hoo didn't expect such behavior from his son, so he once again emphasized that he needed to get dressed first. But it was useless because he was already standing next to Tai-yun. The latter, in turn, asked who bought him such a nice outfit. The boy replied that his grandmother had bought it for him. The boy took Tae-in his arms, greeted In-hoo, and asked him if he was too early. He replied that he was on time. Then he asked if he had changed his hairstyle. Tai-yun replied that he had. He assumed that the boy probably didn't like it very much, so he touched his neck with his hand and asked if it looked strange. However, he was greatly encouraged by Tae-in when he said that his uncle looked a lot like the Red Ranger. In-hoo smiled and asked him not to listen to his son. Instead, he added that it suited him very well and he looked cool with it. Suddenly, the boy asked him to let go and told Tai-yun that he had something for him. However, In-hoo's surprise was overwhelming when he saw that his son was carrying a piece of paper where he had recently drawn something and didn't want to show him. It turned out that he had been trying very hard for his uncle, Tai-yun, so he drew him smiling and next to a sun. The boy asked the kid if he really drew it for him. He whispered that he did. Tae-yun's happiness knew no bounds. He was beaming, showing off the drawing. In-hoo confirmed that it was really cute and admitted that his son had kept it a secret even from him. Tai-yun knelt down and thanked the boy once again for such a beautiful drawing. He also added that he was very touched by it. Tai-in was happy that his work was not in vain, and when Tai-yun said that he would keep it, the boy promised that he would draw more. After a while, they found themselves in the park. There was a lot of entertainment and toys there, and they were all dedicated to Detective Bruce. Tae-in's eyes were dazzled by what he saw because his favorite hero was everywhere, and it was something incredible. Meanwhile, they went to the ordering table, and the waitress said that the reservation was confirmed. After that, she gave them a badge and asked them to put it on the child. At the same time, Tai-in heard a lot of children gathered nearby. He knew that his dad had asked him not to go far, but the noise was very tempting. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and ran as fast as he could to where he could hear the children screaming and see Detective Bruce. Tae-yun noticed that the guy was very nervous about his son, so while they were waiting for the order, he said that he would go get him himself. When he saw Tai-in with the balloon, the boy emphasized that he shouldn't have run away and needed to be with his father. The boy apologized, so Tai-yun explained that he wasn't scolding him, he was just worried and offered to hold hands. In-hoo continued to observe the boy's behavior and overheard them talking about why the boy liked Detective Bruce. He replied that it was because he was a dog. Looking at how cheerful and happy they were, In-hoo realized that his son liked Tai-yun very much. So he didn't know what to do because he became even more attached to the boy. The whole day was filled with positive emotions. They played, bought toys, and had dinner in a cafe. So, after such a busy program, it was not surprising that Tai-in went straight to bed as soon as he got home. Tae-yun noticed that the boy was very tired. In-hoo smiled and told him that he was falling asleep while he was changing him, and it was all thanks to him. The boy confirmed that they really had a lot of fun today. After that, he asked if In-hoo liked everything. He replied that he had a good time and did not even know that such events existed, so it was a discovery for him. Suddenly, Tae-yoon took In-hoo's hand and put it to his face, and then he asked him to say some compliments to him. The guy was confused, so he asked what kind of compliments he wanted to hear, although he realized that he was just trying to get his attention and was being as cunning as a fox. He asked not only that, but also that he kiss him. In-hoo agreed, although not immediately. After that, the guy blushed and turned his head to the side, asking if that was enough. But he replied that he wanted more. In-hoo apologized and asked him to wait so as not to rush things if he suddenly decided to do so. Hearing these words, Ta-yoon turned around and said that everything was fine and he should go home. However, In-hoo stopped him by grabbing his sleeve, asked him to wait, and explained that he could help him. Tae-yoon was shocked by this turn of events, so In-hoo said that he would just be alone in the next room and asked if he was sure he would be okay. He added that the guy just didn't look like he was okay, and he knew it was all because of him. So even though Tae-yoon felt ashamed, he allowed the boy to help him. A few minutes later, In-hoo smiled and said he was going to the bathroom to take a shower. Tae-yoon was left alone in the room and could not believe that this was happening to him. He thought that the guy had just lost his mind. However, In-hoo was also reproaching himself for leaving the room so easily, so he tried to do everything he could to distract himself from his stupid thoughts. When he returned, he immediately heard Tae-yoon's excuses. He explained that he was in the wrong and asked him to take out all his anger on him. However, the boy said that he was not angry. In-hoo suddenly realized that he must have been thinking about all of this while he was in the shower and didn't know what to do about it. The only thing he could think of was to ask if he had been crying. Tae-yoon replied that he hadn't. So he smiled and said that he should go wash his face as well. However, he was surprised and said he could do it at home. In-hoo pointed out that it was quite late and invited Tae-yoon to stay at his place and sleep on the couch.